welcome to the second of two media sociology screencasts looking at media representations of ethnicity. So in the previous screencast we introduced the concept of media representations and we looked at some of the negative stereotypes of certain ethnic minorities as criminals in the media. And in this screencast we're going to finish this topic off by looking at a range of other negative stereotypes and myths that we can find about ethnic minorities in certain sections of the mass media. And we're going to begin by looking at some of the ways in which ethnic minorities are often portrayed as being a threat to the majority white culture. For example, right-wing tabloid newspapers within the UK often panic about the number of ethnic minorities in Britain. And immigrants are often portrayed as being a threat to mainstream British society because of their numbers, because of their impact on jobs, and their impact on housing and other public services. And in contrast, the potential benefits of immigration to Britain are rarely covered in these types of newspapers. And whereas in the past, concern about immigration has been projected onto black and Asian immigrants into Britain, more recently, because of the expansion of the European Union, concern in the right-wing press has often focused on white Eastern Europeans coming into the UK. And these same newspapers have also been concerned about what they see as the influx of asylum seekers into the UK. And this negative coverage has recently prompted the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to complain that asylum seekers have been turned into faceless bogeymen by an unscrupulous popular press. Another ethnic minority group who are frequently represented as a threat to mainstream British culture, particularly in the right-wing tabloid press, are British Muslims. So as we can see on this slide, the Cardiff School of Journalism and Media Studies reviewed the representation of British Muslims in the media between the years 2000 and 2008, and they concluded that around about 2/3 of this coverage was very negative, focusing on British Muslims either as a threat, particularly in relation to terrorism, or as a problem in terms of the perceived differences in their values compared to the mainstream culture. And the activities of a relatively small minority of extremists tend to be given a lot more coverage than the vast majority of moderate British Muslim opinion. And the recent Leveson inquiry on press standards actually found that in the case of the Express Group newspaper company, so this is the company owned by Richard Desmond, which owns the Daily Star and the Daily Express, that their coverage of British Muslims was particularly negative, and there were a number of very negative stories in these newspapers that had no factual basis whatsoever, such as this particular one that appeared in the Daily Express. And here's another Daily Express story that was found to have no factual basis whatsoever. And here's a story from the Daily Star about Muslim-only public toilets, which again was found to have no factual basis whatsoever. Let's move on to this third theme about ethnicity and dependency. And this theme is about how news stories about less developed countries often seem to imply that the causes of the problems experienced by developing countries are self-inflicted, and that these countries are dependent on the West for help. So media reporting about Africa, for example, is very often dominated by Western experts and Western campaign groups, and informed African experts are often ignored in favour of European or American commentators. Another theme that is sometimes evident in media reporting of ethnicity is the idea that ethnic minority groups compared to the mainstream culture are in some way alien or abnormal. So the cultural practices of ethnic minority groups are often called into question by the British media and are sometimes labelled as being deviant or abnormal. So in this sense, we might conclude that aspects of British news reporting are ethnocentric. And what this means is that it's shaped by the view that British white culture is superior and more natural in terms of its norms and values compared with other cultures. So as a result of this ethnocentrism, the activities of other cultures are likely to be reported as being deficient, inferior, strange or unnatural. For example, Elizabeth Poole has argued that representations of Islam have been predominantly negative within the British news media, and as a result of that, British Muslims have often been stereotyped as being backward, extremists, fundamentalist and so on. And I think we can link Poole's work to the concept of the other, which is illustrated by this particular cartoon. So the concept of the other is used to indicate marginalised groups in society who are characterised by the mainstream media as being somewhat alien, exotic and different compared to the mainstream culture. So othering is a process or a rhetorical device in which one group is seen as being like us and another group is portrayed as being completely different, completely alien as them. So this process of othering increases social divisions. It creates discourses based around notions of us and them. Okay, let's finish this topic by looking at some of the arguments that ethnic minorities, compared to the white majority, are seen as unimportant in sections of the mass media. For example, in his book Flat Earth News, Nick Davis claims that within the newsroom of the Daily Mail, there's much more coverage on the lives of white people compared to non-white people. So, for example, in relation to victims of crime, Nick Davis seems to imply that the Daily Mail are much more interested in the victims of crime if these people happen to be white. In the year 2005, a BBC News Online survey noted that black and Asian people were represented as newscasters and television journalists, but that the range of roles that ethnic minority actors play in television dramas is still very limited. And the survey also noted that ethnic minority audiences were also very hostile towards tokenism. And tokenism is the idea that programs contain characters from ethnic minority groups purely because they should. So ethnic minority audiences complain that black and Asian people are rarely shown as ordinary citizens who just happen to be black or Asian, that more often they play black roles in which their attitudes, behaviour and interaction with other social groups are shaped primarily by their ethnic identity. So in the last two screencasts, we've looked at a range of negative stereotypes and myths about ethnic minorities, but we need to be careful not to overgeneralise. So a lot of the analysis in the two screencasts has focused on media representations in right-wing tabloid newspapers. And as Gauntlet points out, sociological analysis of media representations needs to be cautious because of the sheer diversity of media within Britain. So there are other sections of the British media that are perhaps providing more positive representations of ethnic minorities than the ones that I've focused on in these two screencasts. And although I think we are right to note that black and Asian victims of violent death seem not to get the same attention within the media as white victims, there are exceptions. So the murder of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence by white racists in 1993 received high-profile coverage even in right-wing tabloid newspapers such as the Daily Mail.